This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and we are back with another contributor to Colorizing Restorative Justice. Gilbert Salazar is our guest today, and he is an educator focusing on anger management, sexual assault prevention, and healthy relationship building, as well as conflict transformation and social emotional learning. He uses theater and ritual work for violence prevention within young men, which I think is such a cool way to incorporate restorative justice into his life. This conversation talks about dismantling white supremacy culture, especially in terms of urgency, as well as the arts and the connection to restorative justice. Before we get into this conversation, I have a huge announcement for today. We have relaunched our community gathering spaces with the Future Ancestors Collective. Every week, our community meets online to support each other in living in this restorative justice life. We have spaces for parents, people who work in youth, an open space for everyone, and a book club and gathering just for BIPOC RJ practitioners. These gatherings are all free and open to all, and if you want to support the behind-the-scenes work of Amplify RJ, there is a space for you to make a monthly contribution. We also have a super special collaboration with Liz Kleinrock from the Teach and Transform Instagram account. She is hosting an Intro to RJ, Racial and Restorative Justice for her community, where we'll be discussing the intersection of restorative justice and ABAR education. You can check all of this out in the show notes below, and that's all for our announcements. Let's get into this conversation.
Welcome, Gilbert. Who are you?
Today, I'm alive.
Who are you?
I'm a writer.
Who are you?
I'm an RJ practitioner.
Who are you?
I'm a medicine maker.
Who are you?
I'm the son of an immigrant woman.
Who are you?
I'm pretty super Chicano.
And finally, who are you?
I'm a person who communicates with plants and birds.
Well, we're going to talk about the intersection of so many of those things throughout our conversation. But before we do, it's always good to check in the fullest way of answering this question. How are you?
I'm excited to be here. So I feel like the top part of my body feels like light, and I think my feet feel a little heavy.
Yeah. Say more.
I think I was on the, I would love to be like, I was taking notes, getting ready for this interview, this time with you. I was legit on the couch with my feet up watching an episode of Golden Girls. And so I think my feet are ready to like be lifted. But I just I'm just waiting for the energy that I feel on the top of my body from my energy from in connecting with you to just reach further down my body. And it'll get there.
Beautiful, beautiful. You've been doing restorative justice work for a long time, but probably, as you described in our conversation before, like RJ covers so much. So you were probably doing this work long before you knew the word restorative justice. In your own words, how did you get started?
It's kind of, even because it's so encompassing of everything, it's almost kind of hard to pin a point down. But when I was living in Monterey County, and I was a student at CSU Monterey Bay. And in Monterey County, there was a program called the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, or WARP. And they were doing restorative justice training. And I think as a theoretical concept, I knew what restorative justice was. I think as like an alternate means of incarceration and juvenile justice. And so I was super curious about it as a social justice major student. And so I went for the training, and so I was trained in like restorative mediation. And then from there went to work with young folks and with communities in like alternative or in a re-entry program, so supporting young people who had been impacted by exclusionary discipline, suspended, expelled, incarcerated, and so have been working with them to bring them back into schools and into the school district, and then after that doing sexual assault prevention education work. And when I finished grad school here in LA and was looking for work, I found a job posting for an RJ coordinator. And even though I hadn't been doing a lot of formal RJ work, I knew that to have like a paid position doing RJ was not a typical thing. And so I leaned into it and interviewed and all that, and then really steeped into RJ in schools work. And so was an RJ coordinator at a middle school in Watts, and was like one of the first few RJ coordinators within LAUSD. And then from there slid and shifted into the organization that trained me in RJ practices, which is the California Conference for Equality and Justice. And I've been working with them for 5-6 years now, on top of like a year and a half being an RJ coordinator. So it's been a while. It's been a long minute doing RJ work.
One of the things that you said, like when you heard about like the theoretical framework, it just seems like something that you knew to be true. What was it about that that resonated for you?
I think it was about uncovering what was beneath the incident. And so like what was in the surround, like that a person isn't just defined by an action, but that there's like a whole series of things that went into choice making. And I think that part was, for me, really interesting, which then I think I had a gap or a question of like, well, how do you get there? What are the ways that you get that to happen? And so I think restorative practices like circle and dialogue and using relationships, and I think those have become really the things that answered that gap place of how do you get someone to feel comfortable to share their story, and how do you create a culture where stories are valued?
Yeah, you had that somewhere in you. I know that like arts and writing and theater are important to you, and so that storytelling was resonant for you, I imagine. Was that something that you developed as a younger person?
It was something that really blossomed more as a young adult. And so I think I was always very quiet, very shy, and so that I was drawn to journaling and writing and films. But there wasn't always the encouragement around creative work. My family's was just trying to survive a year. And so even though my parents were always about, you choose what you want to do, and there was always support and encouragement, I don't think there was necessarily the awareness of like where I could go take a dance class, or where I could go and like take a writing class. And so I had to really kind of pursue that on my own when I was in like undergrad and then older. But the moment that really hit it for me was when I was teaching a program with young folks around social emotional literacy, and I ended up asking them through the work of some friends of mine who were theater practitioners and artists, and they knew about theater of the oppressed. And I knew what that was, and I wanted them to come and show me like some techniques. And my friend Joanna and Jamila came to the class and had the students do some image theater, and I was watching. And just the power of storytelling without words, particularly for communities that have been impacted by trauma, and for young bodies that want to move, was beautiful to see. And so that led me to asking the other classes that I taught, the other courses of young folks, show me your most violent choice and direct someone in your story. And knowing the full risk of what that question was, and having worked with young folks in the community of Salinas for a while, and doing a lot of work weeks before.
Yes.
Around, like all of the prep work to be able to get to that before inviting that experience. And so that for me was really the powerful point of, this is why storytelling is really important, and this is why when we're not able to give the full story of what happened on that day or at that time, then there's not going to be the full like expression of that moment, or wanting to dig deeper into it. So young people have always been the greatest teachers, young people and elders, and so they really taught me to take a risk in asking people about their stories, which then like years later as a circle keeper, it's the same thing. Like we're asking people to tell their stories with a specific question or a game. The container is circle, the source is the question. But folks have to choose to step in or not. And so, but theater for me was the initial push for me.
Yeah.
That led me to that.
Yeah, and it's striking. You're one of the contributing authors to the anthology of essays, Colorizing Restorative Justice. And what stood out to me about your particular chapter was that you've written a lot of it in as if it was a play, as if it was a scene where you have these women of color talking about their experiences as a trainer. What was the inspiration for you formatting it in that way?
Well, I had written the short play Sippin' maybe 2 years before, and it had been produced and directed on stage at the Frida Kahlo Theater. And so I saw it, on stage, and I saw it come to life. And the stories in the short play were all like real stories of colleagues of color, women of color, that I was working with, who shared with me their stories about white supremacy, white fragility. And so I just kind of wanted to capture that, and capture it and have folks converse with it. And so when I got the call for abstracts from Living Justice Press, and specifically for the Colorizing RJ book, I don't know, I immediately went to the play, and I was like, oh, it would be cool. I've written this play, but it'd be really cool to actually dig deeper in the content of it, but to still utilize the stories. And so so that helped me. I guess I was leading by my own curiosity, and so that I was still curious about those stories and those experiences, and that's kind of how I like synthesized the two for the chapter.
Yeah, did that involve going back to those colleagues and like asking them more questions and digging deeper, or is that just going off of their experiences which they had previously shared with you, and then like writing based off of the observations of like all the things that you have experienced over the years?
Well, I had done the deep dive with them when I was writing the play, and so I was asking them, and we had a reading of it in the office, just a very small reading. And so there were still questions of curiosity. So that is what led me to write the chapter based on those experiences in those conversations.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I think one of the things that I found interesting in having so many conversations with people who have written in Colorizing Restorative Justice is that like we're writing for different audiences. I'm curious, like, You talk so much about white fragility specifically in that chapter. Who were you intending to read this chapter, and what were you hoping that they would get out of it?
It was, the whole book is centered around the voices of practitioners of color who do RJ, which was already like a beautiful and refreshing place to stand. Mm-hmm. And so it was writing to folks that have been impacted by white supremacy and white fragility in training spaces, but that's everybody, because when we train, it's, unless we're in a racial affinity group, it's with all folks. And so the intended audience was, I think, people of color and also white folks. I think the intended audience is anybody that has been impacted in some way, where there wasn't the I don't want to talk about safety, but where there wasn't the place of risk taking to be vulnerable. And I think that includes everybody, but we're impacted in different ways by people's actions and by systems of power. But to go back to your question, it was really, I think I was thinking of folks of color initially. But at the same time, I will tell you that going back to Sippin, which is the play that I incorporate in the chapter, the very first night that I saw it, it was staged in front of an audience, and then we had a talk back with all of the writers, because there was 10 plays that were all in the same evening, and it was pretty much a Latinx audience, and all of the writers were Latinx. But the biggest criticism about Sippin was from one of the writers who was Latinx, and she talked about her husband and her in-laws who are white in the audience, and so she was super activated by Sippin, by the story of 4 women of color talking about their impacts of white fragility. And so there's a lot of layers even amongst folks of color, and so I think I just kind of allowed all of that to flow through, but centering my own experience around storytelling.
Well, yeah, it's
in those spaces.
It's really interesting that you say that. I can vividly think in my own life, specifically in restorative justice spaces, working with a team of folks from different backgrounds and white woman tears, like drawing so much attention. And even for myself, it's like, I think there's a balance. At the time, I thought it was like, hey, like we're all here in space. We're holding each other. And so like this person is displaying like pain and sadness. So let's attend to that. And I had a colleague of color, someone who is a woman of color, call that person out and say like, you're just taking up the space in all this room, and like calling us out, me and a man of color in the space, like, and you're giving her like all of the attention in the space where, this is not about rescuing that person, right? There is a lot of work that like even me as a person of color, right, needs to do around how we hold energy like that in those spaces.
I try and like lean into each training or circle with like, what am I in service to, or what do I want to bring into this space? And one of the things that I often bring in is this idea that there's always more to learn. And so I think as a way to not shame where folks are in their awareness or experience in emotions and in vulnerability, and that there at least could be this common place, so that there's always more to learn, and wherever you are is where you are. And the other part of it that RJ has taught me is that I have the possibility to harm anybody at any time. That whether it's a game called Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop, or whether it's a question of what is a smell that you love, that there will always be the risk of activation. And so I just have to lean into that. And when there is activation or when there is harm, like, how am I going to lean into accountability with that? And so I think kind of holding that has freed me in a sense to be able to lean in more when vulnerability will happen, or when I mess up, which is often.
Yeah. What's an example of a time that happened? Maybe with 50-50 bot, because like I'm just trying to imagine what that would have looked like. And how do you recover that? And maybe recover is not the right word, but like, how do you like take the next action towards healing?
Well, with Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop is a theater game, and I have a master's of applied theater, which was the year just before I started my RJ in schools work. And so when I started as an RJ coordinator, it made total sense of this idea of very few folks in this classroom, in this community, in this faculty, in my own experience, have had to sit in a circle and respond when an object is passed around a group of 30 people. And so I was like, that's actually kind of a ridiculous expectation to put on anybody. So in a moment when I was drowning, meaning there was like a fight about to happen, a young person was like on the shelf about to jump down, there was all this happening, teacher was in the corner grading papers, not in the circle. I just remembered a game that I had played when I was 19 and in AmeriCorps. And then I, through the use of curiosity and kind of setting up a challenge and being creative, that game helped me to begin this work of the talking piece, and we're going to wait and respond, and I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to give a story if you want. And so that was really beautiful and powerful. And so Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop is a game where you're in a circle in the pre-pandemic times, and there's somebody in the middle, and you go up to somebody and you say Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop, and the other person who is in the circle, who you like approached, has to say bop before you as the middle person say bop. And so if they say bop, the point is to try and get someone to say bop after you say bop. And so, and it's like a crazy silly game. And I think one time, early on, not in RJ, but when I co-taught theater classes at Free LA High School, which is part of the Youth Justice Coalition work. You know, Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop can be a really challenging thing for anybody to say, particularly if English is not your first language, or if you have, challenges with fluency in speech. And so I think one time somebody was struggling to say Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop. And I think what I did was I switched the student, and I went in the middle of the circle, and I just took over, but I just like eased the pace, and I was like bibbidi bibbidi, and I just kept be super slow with it, and just like slowed everything down. And eventually I did get somebody out, which was part of the game, but I think it was just a thing of like, it doesn't have to be this speed, it could be slow. And so I think that was an example of like switching it up to accommodate what needs to happen. And I think going back to the power of games, that the remix is always possible. And so if somebody, and there's different things that you do in the game of Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop. It's not always just that one phrase. But I think RJ's taught me that the remix is always possible.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to when I was having a conversation with Kate Pranis about like, this work is about values, it's not about technique. Right? And so, like, yes, there are rules to the way Bibbidi Bibbidi Bop was originally played, but if in the process of playing that way, you're harming folks, like, what do you need to do to switch it up to meet the needs of the people? So this is like an inclusive, fun, silly, like, let's make fun of ourselves as we struggle over words and like weren't paying attention, right? I think you did a good job explaining what is a difficult game to explain over an audio medium. Because I know the game, but for those that aren't listening, YouTube a video of it being played, and that will make sense. You mentioned that you have done a lot of your work has been training, right? Whether it is as an RJ coordinator in a school, or now with CCEJ where you're working with multiple schools. What is a lesson that you've learned about training that you'd like to share?
A lesson that I've learned about training is to listen to my intuition. And so to find the temperature of the room, and to switch something if that needs to be switched. And so that the agenda is not precious, that the container is important and of value, but the agenda itself is not precious. And so if my intuition, or if I'm assuming something, then I need to try something different, and until I hear laughter, or people naming what they need, or people just looking as if they feel comfortable in the space. And so I think it, intuition, to listen to intuition, and to pause for that, and so if I'm not sure what the group needs or what I need, sometimes I'll just sit and hold some silence. And often when I do that, in that silence, intuitively there's some message, and in a very deep way. I don't think I've ever said this to anybody, but sometimes in holding that space, I can hear what the question is that someone is in someone's head that isn't being asked. And so for me, then it's a space of what do I do in this container so that question could be expressed, or that need or that statement could be expressed. And so I think deep listening and intuition have really sharpened my own skills, because I think I came in with them, but I think the work of particularly Circle has really helped me with that.
Yeah, it's this thing about I think a lot about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. That's how we frame a lot of our work with Amplify RJ against that, right? So when we think about like worship of the written word, like, oh, we got to cover this, like with a sense of urgency, it has to happen like within this time, and like, not really caring about the process of getting there, but just making sure the quantity of what we've covered, or all of that is there, doesn't lend to really teaching this work well. Restorative justice work, one of my mentors, one of my teachers in the past, shared with me that this work is too urgent to rush. And so like we do need to take those moments to slow down, like you said, because if people aren't getting them, understanding this learning, and you're pushing them past that, like they're not having a good experience, and so they're much less likely to embody this work. And as much as we really need people to make these changes and shift the way that we are as a society and with each other, it's not a thing that we can force on our timeline,
Yeah, and I think one of the beautiful things about this work is that it can cause folks to pause, to legit be like, we're gonna play a game, and we're gonna be in this game until we're not. And so, I think just the ability to pause is can be a challenging thing in this modern life, in this moment, even before the pandemic.
Yeah. What helps you remember that in life and as you do this work?
In life, what helps me to pause is, I think, just, really tapping into how my body is feeling. Even, you gave the gift of the question of how am I doing? And so I just, immediately felt that my shoulders felt different from my feet. And so, like, just naming that, not to question it, but just to name it. And so I think to name and identify and recognize what is being felt in the moment is really powerful for me. That helps me to pause in my life. And then I think in this work, having objects that are really important for me, having like a stone in my pocket, or having a talking piece that's really of value next to me, having like sprays. So, in the before times when we trained in physical space, I would bless the room, and there's different sprays that I use, and I would do that. I would spray myself. And
With,
then
like, essential oils? Okay.
yeah, like essential oils or sprays that I would make. And then last spring, I got super anxious and like overwhelmed, and the beginning of a virtual world and virtual work, which I was not used to. And then I realized that I wasn't doing any of those things. Like I wasn't spraying myself or my area or having the things that were really of value to me. I also wasn't smudging myself after a training, which is also a practice. And so I was like, oh, this pandemic made me, I forgot that those things are important to me. And so, yeah. And the other thing that I do, which I also like, I don't talk about this in coaching with folks or in a training. So I'm super happy to name it now, but a part of my preparation has always been prayer. And so it's always been intention setting and gratitude for myself and my body, my skills, and the ancestors and spirits that have brought me into this moment in my story. And what I'm asking for today is boom or blank, this. And may an ancestor or a spirit guide or a relationship do the same thing for each of the participants. And when I was feeling super anxious in like April, May of last year, and I was doing all the coaching and trainings, I wasn't doing that. And so I forgot about that. And so that part of my prep work that helps me to ground me and pause me is intention setting and prayer for me and for the folks that I'm going to be in space with. And I've seen a difference when I don't do that I and we are just not in a grounded place. And so for me, that's been super important. And when I do coach folks in this work, I ask them before a conversation or a training that you're doing or a circle, what's your own preparation? I think that's really important for folks to have before they engage in any type of restorative practice.
Yeah. This work being so much about relationships, and the first relationship we have is the one with ourselves, right? How are we taking care of ourselves as we're moving in to do work that's taking care of others is really important to remember. I really appreciate you, like, before we got on recording, asking me, like, what are the things that I've been doing, because it's been tough in these days. I think partially pandemic wise, for sure, not being able to see people in the way that we used to, and like just not having those same feelings, like having trained like upwards of 1,500 people, or sat in space with 1,500 people, like giving this kind of learning to, it's like it's not the exact same thing where like it's just click 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 and here are 30 new faces, versus like walking into a room, putting down your center, arranging chairs, taking a moment to sit in your chair, right? I sit in this chair all day. Sometimes I stand, like I just recently got the standing desk, but it does take a lot more intentionality. How else have you adapted this work in pandemic life?
How else have I adapted to this work in virtual space? There was always, I and a lot of my colleagues would always play music, when we would open up the room and folks would come in. And a really beautiful thing about training over Zoom is that the moment that you let folks in from the waiting room, you could like queue up a song. And so they come in and they hear the song before even they like see your face, or as they see your face. And so that's been a really powerful adaptation. It's similar, I guess, to when you walk into the room, to a room, but I think there's something really beautiful about when folks, the little windows pop up and I'm playing like a Stevie Wonder song and folks, begin to like move. And so that's been really nice to incorporate music, and I think to really challenge folks, invite folks to really listen. Whereas before, folks might still walk in on their cell phone or talking to somebody else. And so I think that the pausing more for the sound, for the music, is really helpful. Or sometimes in the last May, when it was the end of the school year, I would have like a soundscape. So I'd have like a crackling fire or like water, like ocean waves, as folks would come in from the waiting room. I think the other thing is, I mean, I miss people, I miss turning to folks in a circle. And so, but there is something even more vulnerable about like people are flattened in front of you as opposed to like in a round space. And so I almost find like looking more directly at people, like there's that more of that option or availability when folks have their cameras on. And then I think that other thing that comes to mind is that, you know, I could wear like really cozy shoes or like really nice cozy sweats that I may not have been able to wear before, or like show up with a beanie, you know. And I think because, you know, barbershops have been closed and we're in a pandemic and like we're all impacted in various ways, some of us more than others, but we're all impacted in some way. And so I think that just it's kind of brought more of that realness and additional vulnerability of, oh, I can see your kitchen, or oh, that's your couch, or oh, that's your baby in the background, or that's your dog barking. And so I think it's in some ways this virtual world and training, I think, has humanized us in a deeper way, in a faster way than in circle. So like, for example, one of the things that we do in CCJ on like day 2 of community building when we train in the physical form is asking folks to bring in an object of significance or value to share, you know. But that becomes their homework because we say on day 1, tomorrow please bring in an object of value or significance. And we've turned that into like a scavenger hunt on the day of. And so we're like, we're going to give you a break. You've got 10 minutes. Here's a list of different prompts of objects that you can choose from. Please, on your break, select one. And when we come back, we're going to ask you to show it to the camera. And one of the prompts is show us a place show us a view that folks don't often get to see. And so sometimes folks have showed like, this is where I cook food in the kitchen, or this is where I create. And so like they get up and move the phone or the laptop. And that has been really powerful to like watch. And so that's been an adaptation that has been really nice in this moment.
Yeah. The values stay the same. The techniques change, right, based off of our surroundings. It's just still very much with me. You know, we have a lot of us have had to adapt. You and I sit in the position where we're teaching folks to do this work, but I do it more from the perspective of individuals who are coming and looking to learn. You're doing it from the perspective of you're working with specific schools, right, who are going through this process. How have you, and because you're working with multiple schools, you've seen how people have adapted. I know it would be helpful for people who are listening who work in schools to hear some of like the challenges and successes people have had adapting this work to the school context.
A lot of the challenges are still similar to even before the pandemic, which is around time. And so schools will be like, when is there the time in the PD to do a check-in question or to play a game? Or a teacher will say, when in the day can I do circle? And that is still a challenge, even in this virtual distance learning world. And my standing in accountability and of this work, and my work as a coach, is to really ask very focused questions. And so a question sometimes I could ask is, if there wasn't the time before and there isn't the time now, then when will the time be? That if we can't take if we have not checked in to ask colleagues and students how we are doing in a moment of collective crisis, such as in a pandemic, or in a daily crisis moment of a day, then when can we? And so there's the continued challenge around time. And so I think this is where sort of RJ kind of looks up at transformative justice, which is really asking about the whole system that we live in. And RJ, at least the way the CCJ is practicing it, is not so much about creating the whole structure of a school, but it's more about what in the structure of the school that exists can be re-altered to meet the needs of relationships, or to meet the needs of people. And so a challenge continues to be time. The schools that paused to make time to ask a check-in question in the PD, or play a game, or took 10 minutes a week to be in circle, the schools that found ways to do that before the pandemic had a easier transition in distance learning. The schools that were struggling with that continue to struggle, and I think one example is students with their cameras turned off. And so I've asked teachers or principals of what's the impact of restorative dialogue or games or checking questions in terms of teachers that use them and teachers that don't. And the response that most principals say is that they think about it and then they're like, actually, Miss So-and-so, who does a lot of affective statements, she has more cameras turned on than Mr. So-and-so that doesn't. And so I think that there's that simple way of evidence that shows, in terms of wanting the camera on and off, and obviously there's a lot of challenges and complications of wanting your camera on, especially for a young person and also for a grown person. Yeah, the time continues to be a challenge, and I think the other challenge that I would name is folks' own vulnerability to try something that might seem like a risk, or that challenges their own positional power. And so a teacher responding to a question about how they feel can be a risk for them in terms of their own ideas or notions of safety. And so in training and coaching, we work a lot with teachers around what was around their own impacts when they share and express with colleagues, and or how that impacts their relationships. And so I think pandemic or not, a distance learning or not, time and vulnerability are still, I think, the biggest challenge. Time, a challenge within systems, and vulnerability, a challenge of people that have been impacted by living and working in those systems.
Yeah, it's funny because those are the same challenges that we experience, whether we're in person or IRL. Really, we're challenging, the way things have been for years. We're challenging a school system that doesn't prioritize relationships, and if you're not going to make the time to prioritize relationships, or if you yourself decide that you're not going to participate in relationships in that kind of vulnerable way, in a way that shares power, that's not gonna help the work. Have you worked with any schools that have been able to make that change during the pandemic?
In terms of building relationships?
Yeah, because you were saying the ones that were doing it well before are doing it well now, and those that weren't, maybe not so much.
I think I see some principals, the ones who've been struggling around time making and goal setting in this work. I think I've seen some of those principals really pause in their PDs to ask folks how they're doing, or to have expectations around it's okay to not be okay. And I think maybe that's been, one of the more powerful things that I've heard in terms of messaging from some administrators around just setting this framework that this time is really, really stressful and activating. And so it's okay to not be okay. And also around self-care and around creating space for teachers to talk about self-care, which I think was something that many schools have done even beforehand. But I think there were the schools that have been trying to do or incorporate or go deeper into this work in this time, I think I've seen folks, yeah, like one, like given this framework of it's okay to not be completely ready, and what are you going to do to take care of yourselves? And I think that one question can be really impactful.
Yeah, for sure. And I've heard you have conversations with multiple people that you've worked with on your podcast. What you know about RJ is one of the other reasons that I'm really excited to have you today. Not just because of the work that you're doing here, where we both are in Southern California. Not just because of your contributions to colorizing restorative justice, but as far as I know. Restorative Justice on the Rise, the podcast by Molly Rowan Leach. This one and your podcast, again, What You Know About RJ on Apple, Spotify, and all the other podcatchers, are the ones that are like out there talking about this work. And most recently, you've been talking with people who you've been working with in schools. Tell us a little bit about the podcast and what made you start one.
Before this CRJ book, there were and still are very little works that document this experience of RJ work by practitioners of color specifically. And so that was a big gap. And practitioners of color that do this work with schools and communities of color, and practitioners who also want to talk about spirit and intuition and this sort of deeper dive into what this work can be and its connections to indigenous practices and paradigms and ways of being in life, which involve perception and intuition, and how to be in a relational way. And so because of that gap, and because I've worked with two teams of folks at CCJ. Our current team is called Illuminad, which is Spanish, which means to illuminate. And the past team was RJ in Schools. And everybody that I've worked with on both teams have been amazing practitioners that, because RJ is not a field where you, like someone in high school today can be like, I'm going to go major in RJ and do it. I don't think that's the case. I hope that one day that will be the case. But I think that, RJ is such a wide field, the way that applied theater or theater of the oppressed is, that everybody came in from different disciplines and used their experience from different disciplines to really fill up the space of their own gifts and expressions. And so I wanted to document and archive the folks that I work with and all that they brought, and just the ways that I've seen them be amazing in space, and just to capture the conversations that we would have after a training or in the office or on the way to a training, that went beyond the agenda and the specific topic that we were training for or with. So I wanted to capture all those voices. And with our most recent season, which is around interviewing our school partners around culture, relationships, and justice, I wanted to capture and honor the work of the school partners who've been doing amazing work for 3, 4, 5 years, who are also teachers for me in this work. And I wanted to capture the work that they were doing and the impacts that they were doing. And folks that work in schools, teachers, admin, are incredibly busy, and so it's challenging for them to sit down and document the amazing work that they're doing. And so often a lot of this culture building work gets either gets lost if the culture is not sustained within the school, if someone leaves, or the admin or the school culture team, or it becomes so ingrained in the school culture that folks are not able to pinpoint, we do this because this was this one person's suggestion, or we do this because a student brought this to us. And so I wanted to, if RJ is about narrative and story, I really wanted to use the media podcasting to capture all of those experiences. And so it was really important for me to do that. And I needed something to shift from, besides just training and coaching, which I had been doing a lot of, and I wanted to shift into another realm with RJ. And so it's been a really beautiful experience for me with What You Know About RJ.
Are there like one or two episodes that you would be like, hey, you should start with this one that listeners of this podcast should go check out right now?
There's one that just this week, at the time that as we're recording and having this conversation, I'm prepping and producing the new season, which is about like expanding the perception of RJ. And so I'm super excited about those, but I think
well, it'll have aired by the time this airs. So.
Yeah. Well, so there was I did a tiny series last spring around RJ in the community, or healers in the community. And Spirit is in Restoration, I think is the name of it. And it's with, I interviewed a really amazing yoga practitioner friend and teacher of mine. And he does some breathing practices over the episode. And we talk about breathing and breath and trauma and relationships. And so that, I feel, has been a really powerful episode. And one that when I go back and look at the stats of who's listened, is one that folks have listened to a lot. So that one is really powerful. I think that's the one I would highlight in this moment.
Yeah, for sure. How do you want to continue to grow in this work? What's next for you?
What's next for me is continued documentation of this work, continued research and study around intuition. And I want to study intuition because of my work as an applied theater artist and as a practitioner of theater of the oppressed, which for folks who don't know is a form of an application of performance and theatrical practices with community to develop and present their own stories of conflict or challenge, to be able to practice how to intervene in those conflicts and challenges that are existing. And then there's sort of that larger communal conflict aspect of the work, and then there's this very psychological inner part of the work within the canon of theater of the oppressed. I also, every now and then, will be asked to facilitate, or the language in theater of the oppressed is jokering. The facilitator is called the joker. Theater of the oppressed is from Brazil. It's a practice from Brazil. It's attributed to Augusto Boal and influenced by the communities within Brazil. He's credited for the writing of it, but the work is also super integrated from various practices that are cultural amongst Brazil. But there's been a few times when I've come in to joke or facilitate community building utilizing theater of the oppressed, and there's a couple of gaps that I think exist in that realm, and I think could be really filled in with some of the things that RJ is asking around harm, around who was impacted, how was the relationship impacted, what needs to happen to make it right. And so what's next for me is actually researching and studying the intersection between theater of the oppressed and RJ as a means of conflict. Or I'm super curious about this idea of what if conflict intervention was embodied? What if mediation was embodied as opposed to, this is what happened to me, this is what I want from you to do. And so what's next to me is similar to the next season of What You Know About RJ, is expanding the viewpoint of what we think RJ is or should be, or where we think RJ should exist. And so we previously have been working a lot with schools. We are now working a lot with community organizations and workplaces. And so for me, I always lead by curiosity, and where I'm really curious now is that intersection between TO, Theater of the Oppressed, and RJ as a work of healing arts and healing justice.
Yeah, there's so much in there to explore, and like you were saying, like restorative justice intersects with so many things. When we're like, if we define restorative justice broadly, right, with just like being in good relationship, being in right relationship. Like there's so many ways to do that. The other way that you talked about that is plant medicine, which you do. How do you integrate that? You shared a little bit about like the spraying of the oils and things, but like how else do you integrate that?
Yeah, a lot of us at CCJ have taken classes with hood herbalism, and hood herbalism is a community medicine program for BIPOC folks, created by Berenice Dimas. And so there's workshops around how to use, how to bring back ancestral knowledge around plants as medicine and as sources of resiliency, and connecting to spirit. Well, not so much. I mean, that as an interpersonal journey, yes, but hood herbalism's goal is really around teaching folks about plant medicine, and to what is one's personal relationship to the plants. And so when I started to develop deeper relationships with plants, and particularly around the concept of consent, is something that I'm super interested in, because when you harvest a plant to make a spray or make a tea or make a balm, the plant has to give permission to you before you pick it.
Sorry.
And so
BALM, not BOMB.
BALM, yeah.
I was looking at the transcript and I was like, that's not what he meant. That's not what he meant.
Bob. Or just in Spanish, pomada is also the way to say it, but BALM. So the plant has to give consent. And so that was another deeper level of consent practice that I had to apply myself into after having spent years working with young folks around what is consent and what is a culture of consent. And so the plants have taught me to pause, to ask questions, to wait, to listen, like all the things that we do in RJ that best impact a community when we utilize restorative practices. So the plants have been really powerful, especially lemon balm, which I write about in the chapter. And the whole reason why, one of the biggest motivations for me in starting classes with hood herbalism were to figure out what was the tea that my abuela, my grandmother, would give us when we were sick. And there was there was two teas, but one in particular, whether it was a stomach ache or a headache or an earache, she would make this tea, and like power and magic and medicine, it would go away. And so I went in like really wanting to find what that plant was. And the first class is teas and tea making. And we learned about different, steeping times and why you should cover herbal teas to lock the medicine in. And as it's steeping, and there was a cup of tea that was being passed around, and I took a sip, and immediately my body knew what that was, and it was lemon balm. And so lemon balm has been really powerful for me. So they've taught me a lot, and lately I've been working with birds and with a bird healer, and I've been learning how to make bird essences from feathers, and that's a whole nother level of consent practicing and observation. And birds are also really powerful teachers and healers, and have a lot of significant spiritual powers for a lot of folks around this globe. And so birds and plants have been deep teachers for me.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not something that like I've really explored. And I think like the whole idea of interconnection, right? Not just between people, but between nature, is so important to continue to explore, because it's not just that we're connected to each other as people, but like all beings on this earth are called to be in good relationship. I want to transition us into the questions that I ask everyone. They're meant to be rapid fire, but they often don't end up being. Define restorative justice.
As a way of being in community with others and with self.
You get to sit in circle with 4 other people, living or dead.
Ooh.
Who are they, and what do you talk about?
Oh my God, this is a question that I ask folks, and I love that I have it now as a question. 4 folks, living or dead, who wants to come out? Would love to. My abuela, my grandmother passed away because of COVID last year, and so I saw her a few months ago. I saw her not too long before she passed, but I would love to be in space with her. I wasn't able to talk. I told her about my work with plants, but not my work with birds. So I would love to talk to her about hummingbirds. She had a lot of birds when I was little. So my abuela, Emma Berumen Salcido, I would love to sit in circle with a queer ancestor of mine. Particularly one, often before a training or a circle, like I'll call in somebody in, and so sometimes if I'm writing something, often I will do the same thing actually, is I'll invite somebody to sit beside me as I'm writing. And so since some of the things that I write, well, all of the plays that I've written, most of them have some type of queer aspect, content, character that represents myself as well. And so there's always a queer ancestor that I call in. And so I would love to sit in circle with them. And so with that, the next person would be Chabela Vargas, who was a Mexican singer. She sang rancheras. She would dress up in men's clothing of the time, and she had a very raspy voice, and she had women around her, and she was very out in her own self, and my abuela loved her. And I was not able to tell my abuela about my queer identity, but my abuela really loved Chabela Vargas. And so I feel that since she has a connection with Chabela Vargas, that I want to assume that there's a connection she has with my own queerness. And my abuela was very Catholic, but Catholic in a very Mexican sense, and so it went beyond church practice, but very indigenous practice. And so my abuela, a queer ancestor, Chabela Vargas, and the 4th person, I feel like that someone who, I think they're all very playful in the circle already, but the other person would be, I think, a writer, maybe like Gloria Anzaldúa. That's a powerful circle right there. Or like Pablo Neruda, or you know what? It would be awesome to have Prince in that circle. So I'm gonna add the purple one as my 4th choice, and that's like a hell of a circle, like right there.
Beautiful.
And David, you could be the circle keeper, so you're in there too.
Beautiful. Thank you. No one's ever included me in their circle in answering that question, so I really appreciate that. What is one thing you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
I would love folks to know that the next season of What You Know About RJ podcast is gonna be the biggest, craziest, activating, you can't feel the feet underneath you when you're in the ocean type of thing. And so I would love for folks to tune in to season 3, which is coming up soon, or will be out by the time this is out. But we're heating up topics of whiteness in the white supremacy in the workplace, and settler colonialism, and if I'm a settler of color, what do I do with that privilege? How do I become an accomplice with indigenous folks? Or how do I interrogate my own family stories around trauma to support my understanding around discipline and school? And so I would love for folks to be on that journey with us for season 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And Apple, Spotify, all the places. We'll definitely link it in the show notes here. I know that's part of the answer, but how else can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
So RJ and art are also very similar because they require somebody there to witness. And so just like for my story, for me to say my story, the impact is stronger if it's heard. And that's where circle is powerful, but also where the audience in the theater is really powerful, or the reader is really powerful. So to support my work, this is the year that I'm gonna transition from playmaking and development and producing to film work. And so the play that's in my chapter of the CRJ book, I'm working towards developing a short film of it. And so for folks to support my work, for folks to support the vulnerability of me as an artist, somebody to witness is important. And so, again, as part of our season 3, I'm hoping that I recorded the full play with a cast of actors. And I'm hoping that will be included in the podcast. And so my wish or my intention setting or my desire is for folks to be in the audience and to be a witness and to listen to the stories that I have, or to the stories of another artist, another a person of color, queer artist, trans artist, BIPOC artist. And so I think just the way to support me, to support other artists, is to listen and to watch. To support, to be a witness.
Absolutely. And can I direct people to your Instagram for updates on all of that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
We'll also link that in the show notes. And the final question, I realized I didn't ask before. That's usually the last question. But before you answer, you have to know that you have to help me in this. Who's one person that I should have on this podcast?
One person that you should have on this podcast is Edward. I think Edward should have a sit down with you. I think that would be a really powerful episode and conversation. So I'm happy to push the universe for that to happen as well.
We're gonna make it happen.
So I got you.
Well, thank you so much for the time, Gilbert. It was really good to get to connect. I know this isn't the last time you and I are gonna get to connect. Everyone else, please go follow Gilbert on Instagram, follow What Do You Know About RJ, the podcast, on all the platforms. Download, subscribe, rate, review that podcast and this one, so more people know about it. It's just been a real pleasure to get to talk to you over the last hour or so.
Thank you, David. Also for me, it was really beautiful to, like I said earlier, to not be the interviewer and just to submit and surrender to the container that you created. And so I felt super lifted and appreciated and super grounded, and the ability to take whatever risk I needed to or wanted to in the responses. So much appreciation to you.
Well, thank you. I don't know if I'm going to leave that in, but thank you. And to everyone else, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Elise here. Here are some things that I've thought about from this episode today. Gilbert made a great connection between the arts and restorative justice that really stuck out to me. I am someone who's very involved in my arts community, and I think that it is so important to connect to your passions in your community, and that there are ways to tie restorative justice into those as well. For example, with theater, as he was mentioning, it can connect to empathy by stepping into someone else's shoes. It can connect to expression of your own emotions, and so much more. What are the ways that you connect restorative justice to your interests? Also, I really enjoyed the encouragement that Gilbert gave to pause and think. In your busy life, how can you find moments to pause and think and check in with yourself? Before we part, I would like to quickly remind you about our Future Ancestors Collective, and all the information that you need can be found in the show notes below. Thank you so much for listening today, and see you in the next one.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.